percent of people want to write a book, and less than 1% end up with a published book. And even fewer, probably 1% of 1%, with multiple published books. This industry is a funnel. So what is a funnel? Well, understand that the publishing industry would really prefer that you self-select out of wanting to be a writer. In marketing and sales, a funnel maps the journey a potential customer or lead takes from their first interaction with a business until they make a purchase. It's called a funnel because the number of people who see the ad is much greater than those who go to the website, is much greater than those who sign up for the newsletter and are exposed to a product multiple times, which is greater than those who finally end up purchasing. An even more apt funnel for our situation is one that's a lot less well known, from a little tabletop role-playing game similar to Dungeons and Dragons called Dungeon Crawl Classics. Dungeon Crawl Classics wants to bring the brutality and sudden death back to tabletop role-playing games that used to be there in Dungeons and Dragons First Edition. And so every campaign begins with a zero-level funnel game, where each player brings a handful of zero-level characters, meaning they're just normal people, not of heroic stature at all, and then the game master runs them through a meat grinder of a session until there are only a handful left. Those all level up to level 1 and continue on the adventure. I think you can see where I'm going with this. There is a writer funnel, and each stage is a meat grinder, reducing the number of authorial adventurers. As I discussed this, which is something I pointed out in an earlier episode, I'm going to be taking percentages from different sources. They usually have small sample sizes. The respondents, I'm sure, are self-selecting. So take it all with a grain of salt. I would say, if anything, the numbers are rosier for how many people actually end up publishing than presented by these studies. And so I think that we can learn from this. First, let's go through every stage of the funnel, describing how it knocks people out of the game. And then we're going to go back through and look at how to make it past each narrowing of the funnel. So it all starts with desire. 80-something% of people want to write a book. Desire eliminates something less than 20% of the entire population. You might think that that means that there's over 80% of the population who are active readers, but sadly, that's not even close to the case. There are a bunch of people who want to write books who do not enjoy reading them. This is not a sad part of the funnel. Those 20 or so percent of people, they're not interested. The next part of the funnel is the idea. Ideas are a dime a dozen. I don't think that this stops that many people. Are they all ideas that can support an entire novel? No way. But it's enough that the potential author believes it to be. The idea only needs to be able to support the novel some 1% of the time, because the vast majority of these never see anywhere near completion. Funnily enough, while I said that ideas are a dime a dozen, my slow drip of ideas has halted my ability to write my next book at multiple points, causing me so much stress, so much more than the actual writing of the book ever did, especially when I was under contract to produce within a certain period of time. I desperately tried a lot of techniques based around multiple different tools in order to ease the creation of ideas. And it's something that I would like to show all of you in a future video. This eliminated my greatest source of stress because none of the rest of this funnel even applies if you end up getting stuck at the point where you need to have an idea of something to write about. The next tightening of the funnel is starting the book. Now, this step eliminates a good percentage of writers. People love talking about the book that they're going to write one day. That talk is actually enough to satisfy some people, at least satisfying them enough to prevent them from talking. That is the danger of visualization. That is the danger of taking on the identity of a writer when you're not actually regularly writing, or the identity of a novelist when you don't actually complete novels. And I talk about that in another video, one of my first, that you should go check out, about the danger of the writing identity. So while over 80% of people want to write a book, according to a 2021 study, only 15% actually started. And considering that it seems to me that the methodology of this study was that they just took whoever responded to it, my bet is that 15% is a much higher percentage than the actual number of people who start a novel. I'm going to guess that the majority of people who didn't start a novel also didn't bother replying. This stage of the funnel catches at least 70% of potential writers. That's huge. Just starting sets a person apart from most other people. The next narrowing of the funnel is Act 2. In the same survey that I just discussed, only 6% of the respondents made it to the halfway point. Act 2 kills books dead. I just did a video on this. You might want to check it out if you yourself struggle with Act 2. Act 2 is twice as long as either of the other acts, and yet not nearly as fun to write as either one of them. What kind of cruel trick is this? But it's just how it is. Your protagonist spends more time in the thick of the trouble than either discovering it on the one hand or solving it on the other. The next narrowing is actually completing the novel. While I think that Act 2 has to be responsible for the most unfinished books, there are people who reportedly drop out after that point. Apparently, only 3% of people who actually start the book finish it. Not 3% of people, but 3% of people who start. I have to think that the difference between this and the people who make it past the halfway point are people who can't think of a satisfying way to wrap up their books. And they set it aside until they figure it out. And the problem is that once your head isn't in the book anymore, you're actually less likely to figure it out. I'm not saying you want to bang your head against the wall for hours, but you do need to keep your head in your story. I think this is especially likely if you write in a genre or just a style that creates a lot of threads that you need to tie back together by the end, and that you have to do it in both a believable and a narratively satisfying manner. I think we all can point out stories that tied up all the threads, but in order to do so, did it in completely unbelievable ways that pull you out and make you not care about the ending. Trying to do both is not only difficult, it's intimidating. So that means that completing the novel takes us down to a single percent. And you think, well, that's the end, right? The novel is written. But we're not just talking about completing a novel. We're talking about getting the novel out there in front of people, and we're talking about having a writing career. So let's look at the next narrowing of the funnel, the next tightening of the weave of the strainer, and that is publishing. 20 years ago, this was a dead halt for 98 or 99% of writers who finished their book. The publishing industry seems to agree that a writer's odds for selling their completed book to a publisher is about 1 to 2%. That's not 1 to 2% of writers. That's 1 to 2% of the 1 to 2% of writers who actually complete a book. So 20 years ago, you either got the attention of an agent or a small publisher with your cover letter, and then your sample, and then your whole manuscript, which you printed out and mailed to them, or your book sat and did nothing. There are a very few cases of people who eventually had success after pursuing vanity publishing, which means ordering a print run of books and then selling it themselves. But that was both expensive and demoralizing. And it's not like there were websites where it was easy to include your book amongst all the others, like on Amazon. Today, I have to think it's either the stigma or the complexity of self-publishing that funnels writers out. The stigma is changing as publishers and agents are clearly recognizing the value of writers self-publishing. It's making their job a lot easier for them because they can just see who's already being successful. But the complexity of self-publishing, it's not the complexity of actually doing it, it's the perceived complexity of doing it and the actual complexity of coming out with a coherent set of instructions that you can follow from start to finish and create a nice product without being a tech wizard or wealthy. And because of this friction, there are a million shovel sellers shouting that they'll do it for you, convincing you that you can't do it without spending a bunch of money, which keeps potential successful authors away from it entirely. The final stage of the funnel, the one that really separates people out, but one that I want to encourage you to make it past, is the career stage, meaning multiple books. So the numbers basically dry up here as the sample size has gotten so small, and I also don't know how many people are interested. So remember, just to get the one book published from a publishing house, you're talking about 1 to 2% of the writers who finish their book, which is 1 to 2% of writers who start their book. These numbers are small. And then building a career, that strains out almost everybody left. Many writers write their second book while trying to get their first book published, or while self-publishing their first book, or first trying one and then the other. I'm sure that despite the fact that there aren't studies, that many people who complete their first book complete their second. They have overcome a huge psychological hurdle by proving to themselves that they can write a book, that it's not magic. Like, you can tell yourself that it's not magic, but until you actually complete a full manuscript, I think that a part of you is always going to doubt your ability to do it. So I think that a lot of writers do end up writing a second book. I've seen it myself when I used to participate in writing communities. But what happens when they can't get their first book published, or when they self-publish and they can't get their first book noticed? How many push through and write another book after that? My guess is that there are very few writers who have the ability to write more than 3 books without seeing any kind of headway being made as far as a career, which is sad because each book is probably getting better. Okay, so I said that that was the last stage, but there's one more level of the funnel. You just don't know until you're, I guess, on your deathbed whether or not you've made it, because these are the writers who simply will not stop. The writers who meet no success and yet get past book 3 to books 4, 5, 6, 7. The writers who do have some kind of small success, but it's nowhere near close to like a minimum wage return on their work, and yet they continue to push on for their whole lives. We might imagine an aged writer who never saw any success and has a shelf full of books they've written, and we might think that that is a sad image. But what is a lack of success? I think that that's something that we need to very carefully consider. Okay, so that's it. Those are the stages of this funnel. These are the steps that filter out more and more people until we're dealing with less than 100th of 1%. In this war of attrition, you have to keep pushing ahead. You have to keep fighting. But let's do it smart. It sounds heroic to just gut it out, but if we can make it easier, if we can strategize, if we can not run into a brick wall until either it or we give out. And let me tell you which usually gives out first. I think that we can be in that small fraction of 1% of writers who just keep going. Because for most of us, nothing is gained by giving up. Okay, so this video is getting long. In the next video, we're going to go over all those same steps, but with my strategies that have carried me through to being a multi-book writer. So I guess this is a bit of a cliffhanger ending, and I want to make videos that people manage to get through. So maybe you should hit that subscribe button if you want to find out my techniques for having made it this far. And thank you for having made it this far in the video. I am Jalen Riker, just reminding you to write, read, and live.